Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 160, covering the week of March 4th through March 8th, 2019. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, like our Facebook page at Abbeville Institute, and of course subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. You can find all those social media buttons at the top of our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org, ABBEVILLE, institute.org. And you can also give us an email address on that webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org, and we'll give you a free ebook, and you'll get our Daily Dose of Dixie Monday through Friday and our weekly email on Saturday or Sunday, which includes a link to this podcast. Also, you can get the mobile app, the Abbeville Institute on the go. Just go to your app store on your mobile device and search for Abbeville Institute. You can find that there. It's a great way to keep up with the Institute. All you got to do is download it to your phone free of charge, and you're good to go. You can also help support the Abbeville Institute in our mission to explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition by donating. And of course, on our webpage, you'll see a button at the top that says support. Click on that, and you'll see a tab that says donation levels. If you go there, you can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time donation. You can pay via PayPal or Stripe, and you can also send us a check if you want to do that. But all of that is, of course, tax-deductible to the full extent of the law, so consider a tax-deductible donation to the Abbeville Institute. Help us keep this podcast going, our website, our conferences, all the things we're doing. We have a new project that hopefully will be out sometime in the late spring or early summer. That's going to be fantastic, a way to fight back against the PC hordes that are trying to destroy the South. And, of course, you can also get your Abbeville Institute apparel at that same button that says support. There's a button that says shop. Just go out there and get your Abbeville Institute gear. It's all embroidered, really nice stuff. Shirts, hats, golf towels, fleece jackets. We're getting out of winter now, so you're going to want that great stuff. T-shirts, fantastic materials that you can help support the Abbeville Institute that way as well and show your support, wear it around. It's great advertisement for what we do. And don't forget to always share our material on social media. Rank this podcast, or rate it, I should say, on your podcast websites, iTunes, for example. Going out there and do that because that helps more people listen to it and gets more people involved in what we're doing. Okay, all of that said, let's talk about this week that was at the Abbeville Institute. Had a lot of great stuff, and the general theme for this week is something that we talk about quite a lot. In fact, I was thinking about it before I started doing this show today. We've been doing this now for 3 years. And it seems like in 3 years we talk about a lot of the same things over and over again, and that's because the hordes, the SJW hordes, the politically correct hordes, are just unrelenting in their assault on the South and Southern tradition and Southern heritage. But not just that, it seems that Americans are becoming disconnected more and more with that Jeffersonian tradition, which is a thing that really ties the South today to the South of the 20th century, the early 20th century, and the South of the 19th century, and the South of the 18th century. It's that strain of Jeffersonian thought that we're trying to keep alive. What is true and valuable in the Southern tradition is, of course, a Jeffersonian critique of centralization. It's the Jeffersonian principles underlying a main component and main parts of the Southern tradition that is valuable in that tradition, and why we need to keep those things alive. And if you look at Confederate monuments, Confederate symbols, all of those things, and the left realizes it, they're symbols of defiance. When the war is over and Southerners start to build these things long after the war is over, 30, 25, 30, 40, 50 years, it was a way of showing not just respect for their ancestors, which was important, or even for the living Confederate veteran that was still walking around at that time, but it was also to show that there was a level of defiance. And some of them talked about that. And it wasn't defiance over the things that, of course, the left is going to say, well, you're right. They were defiant over the established racial order in America, because the established racial order in America was the same thing North or South. That didn't matter. It was defiance in that they were still recognizing that their cause of self-determination, their cause of believing in the original Constitution was still right, and still valid, and still worthy of celebration. They might have lost the war, but they didn't, or they might have lost the battle in their mind. They did lose the Grand War, but the war was bigger than just the shooting match between 1861 and 1865. It was for the heart and soul of America. It's for the principles of America, those Jeffersonian principles that hadn't gone away. And so that's why these monuments matter, and that's one of the reasons why we write stories in favor of these monuments and symbols, because that is the attachment that modern Southerners should have with those symbols and monuments. They become distorted by those that want to take them down. That monument is a symbol of what was great about America for so long in American history. This idea of self-determination, this idea of limited central government, of self-government. Those are the things that made America great. And we can talk about, every tradition's got its bad and its good, and but those monuments and those symbols which represent the Confederate soldier who's willing to sacrifice all for self-determination, it's not the same as the American patriots in 1775 or 1776 or 1777. Is that not the same? Many of whom, in fact, every state at that time had slavery. So what's the difference? There is no difference. This is what people don't want you to realize. There is no difference. Now, the real hardcore SJWs understand that, yeah, there really isn't a difference between the two. That's why we need to take down statues of Jefferson and Washington and all those things too, because those people are just as bad as the Confederates. Now, mainstream America wouldn't say that. Mainstream America would say, well, we can maybe have a conversation about Confederate monuments, but we're not going to have a conversation about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. Whereas the people that are behind taking down these monuments want to have that conversation about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington because they're aware. They call them the founding races. This is how bad this stuff is. So one of the things we try to constantly hammer is this Jeffersonian tradition and how important it is for understanding American history and what is true and valuable, not only in the Southern tradition, but in the American tradition. You can't have the South without America, and I've said this before on this podcast, said it for years. The South is America. The South is America. And without the South, America is not what it is today. Now, I think we live in a Puritan America, a Yankee America today, in a lot of different ways. And so the Southern tradition is muted without question and under assault at all times. But it's still there. And so as long as the Institute exists, as long as you exist, you see, as long as you exist and you're listening to this podcast and you're interested in the Southern tradition and what's valuable in it, that tradition can survive. So that's an important thing to get out of this. And the pieces this week really speak to that. The first piece of the week was written by John Devaney, Modern Monetary Theory, a Jeffersonian Critique. Now, if you're not familiar with modern monetary theory, it's essentially the idea that you can just keep printing to oblivion. Just keep printing money, it doesn't matter. Because debt doesn't matter anymore. This is something that's become rather popular, particularly on the left, because the programs they advocate are very, very expensive. And so when people say, well, how are you going to pay for it? We'll just pay for it by printing money. Doesn't matter. We can print to oblivion. And I remember when I was an undergraduate, when I was in a political science course, this was near 30 years ago, the professor that I had actually said, well, look, he assigned a book that the title of the book was Deficit Spending. And the main point of the book was that deficits don't matter. You can spend and it doesn't matter. You see, at that time, people are already thinking about this modern monetary theory. You can just spend and have deficits. It never matters. So we should spend more and have bigger deficits. The Jeffersonian critique of that, as John Devaney gets into, this is very dangerous for the long-term health of an economy. And they had concrete examples. Now, Dr. Devaney doesn't say these things, but if you look at France in the 18th century, that's a concrete example of what happens when you spend, and then you got to try to fix the problem. The French economy was in shambles. And because of that, you had the French Revolution. Economic problems often lead to revolutions. That's not a good thing. And the problem with this spending is that eventually you do get to a point where your currency is so devalued that you have hyperinflation, but not just that. There's no way you can pay back what you've spent. You can't raise enough revenue to do it. And if you keep inflating the currency by printing it, your currency becomes worth less and less. And Dr. Devaney does point out that the Federal Reserve note of today is worth 90% less than it was in 1916 when they first printed the things. 90%. It's lost 90% of its value. 10 cents on the dollar. What you could get for 10 cents back then now costs you $1. That's horrible. And the Jeffersonians, the Jeffersonian Critique, and all these people were Southerners, whether it was John Taylor of Carolina or John Randolph of Roanoke or John C. Calhoun or Thomas Jefferson, or they were interested in arresting this Hamiltonian nightmare. And of course, the Hamiltonian nightmare was only secured because the North won the war. And because the North won the war, you now have big government and big banks getting in cahoots with each other. And of course, that is going to create a big mess. Jefferson and Taylor and others believed that you could handle the two things separately. But once they got together, they created a big Frankenstein that was a problem. And that's the major issue with this modern monetary theory. It's just another type of Hamiltonian ruse to try to get more power in the central government. It is a disaster waiting to happen. So I recommend this piece. If you're not familiar with modern monetary theory, this is a nice little primer on it. There's more out there. The Austrian economists have written quite a lot about this. But one thing people don't recognize or realize with John C. Calhoun, for example, is how interested he was in banking. Calhoun had a financial mind. He wasn't just someone who was out there talking about social issues or government. He understood finances. He understood the problems of debt and monetary policy and all those things. Calhoun was an important thinker, not just for structure of government, but for the functions of government as well. You can't get around that. So we need to understand this Jeffersonian critique, which is, again, why the Abbeville Institute exists. This is a Jeffersonian critique of banking. We could do a Jeffersonian critique of society. We could do a Jeffersonian critique of government. And those Confederate symbols and monuments represent that Jeffersonian critique of America. We know, for example, Jefferson's descendants fought for the Confederacy. They didn't stay with the North. They fought for the Confederacy. So that actually brings us to ask a question: who are the true heirs of the founding generation? And Michael Potts reviews the book Beyond Slavery: The Northern Romantic Nationalist Origins of America's Civil War by Kirkwood. This is a Shotwell Publishing book, a fantastic little book. Kirkwood has actually written a book on nullification. Among other things, he was one of Clyde Wilson's students as well. I think his first student, in fact, one of his first student at South Carolina. And so he graduated back in the early 70s. This book accurately shows that it wasn't the North, it wasn't Northerners, Yankees, that were the true heirs of the founding generation. In fact, the true heirs of the founding generation were Southerners. Now, the modern neoconservative narrative would be that Southerners were the oligarchs. Southerners were not real Americans because they didn't understand republicanism, whereas at the time, they understood republicanism very well. I mean, John C. Calhoun, again going back to Calhoun, wrote quite a lot about republicanism. George Washington, Southerner, spoke a lot about republicanism. So did Thomas Jefferson. Republicanism, of course, with a lowercase r. This is something that we have to understand in looking at the South, what that term republicanism actually means. A lot of people would say the South was oligarchic. It wasn't oligarchic, it was Republican. No more oligarchic than the North, which was dominated by large banking and financial interests, industrial interests, ultimately. In fact, you could say, and some people have argued, the South was essentially more democratic than the North. So, this particular piece is important when you think about the conceptions of the North and the South, the conceptions of Northern and Southern history, and how important it is to know that the South and Southerners, like Jefferson and many others, Patrick Henry, many others, were the true heirs, or I should say the South were the true heirs of that tradition that Henry and Jefferson advocated back in the 18th century. And I think this book by Kirkwood does a nice job doing that. So pick it up. Usually the Shotwell Press books are not expensive. I think this book's about $12. It's highly worth your time to read it. And of course, Kirkwood has written some things on nullification and some other issues, but you should certainly get this one. Certainly get this one. Now, Wednesday we had a piece on a supremely important but definitely forgotten member of the founding generation, George Wythe. And George Wythe, there's a law school at the University of William and Mary, and it's the Marshall Wythe School of Law. Now, this little piece by Robert McReynolds is fantastic in how it goes after the importance of George Wythe. George Wythe was more important than John Marshall. George Wythe was the most important legal scholar in America at one time. He taught John Marshall. And he taught a number of other members of the founding generation, some really important members of the founding generation. And it was George Wythe who was, except for Marshall, who just didn't get it, who instilled in these men what became known as Jeffersonianism. But George Wythe is lost to history. George Wythe, unlike John Marshall, didn't go out of his way to ruin the Constitution. George Wythe, unlike John Marshall, never became an ardent nationalist. That's the reason why George Wythe is essentially forgotten. But George Wythe could have been and should have been a much more recognizable member of the founding generation than he is. And that is a great travesty. Because George Wythe is one of the reasons why we have Jeffersonianism. And this particular piece is actually entitled Preserving What is True and Valuable, Marshall Wythe Law School, or Marshall Wythe School of Law, I should say. Preserving What is True and Valuable. There's the Withepedia. I mean, this is a fantastic, tiny little piece about George Wythe and how important he was to the founding generation, to the future of the United States of America, and also, of course, to Virginia and Virginia's role in all of that. Now, perhaps one of the more important critiques of the Jeffersonians was this critique of monarchy. And the piece on Friday, I'm going to get back to the piece on Thursday in a second. The piece on Friday is entitled, Is Opposition to Trump Satanic? Well, Pat Robertson went on the 700 Club a while back, February 2017, so a couple of years ago, and essentially insinuated this, that if you oppose Donald Trump, you're satanic. You might as well just admit in his mind that you are satanic and that you don't fit within any Christian churches or Christian theology. You're a bad person if you oppose Donald Trump. Well, we know this isn't true. We know the Jeffersonian position is one of critique. We know the Jeffersonian position is one where we have to discuss the issues of the day and then critique that which is bad. It's not to shut down and not do anything. But Pat Robertson is saying, well, I mean, if you oppose Trump, that is a major offense. one of the things we have to remember about the Jeffersonian tradition, and which really is the American tradition, is how important it is for its limitations on centralized power. And what we have in America today, quite clearly, is an elected monarch. And for those that run around saying, well, you can't criticize, if you criticize Trump, you're helping out the other side. Well, really what you're doing when you criticize Trump, if you're holding his feet to the fire and saying these are the things that need to be done, for example, we can talk about an emergency declaration. Is there any kind of constitutional authority for that? If there is, well, I've never seen it in the Constitution. And this is the same thing that Lincoln did. So if we want to be consistent, of course, the game of politics often relies on an inconsistency that everyone follows. But criticizing Trump is not satanic. It's not anything that's awful. Criticizing Trump is purely the Jeffersonian thing to do. Just like criticizing Obama was, or criticizing George W. Bush, or take your pick. But this is Pat Robertson, his 700 Club, as Michael Martin points out in the piece on Friday. This is the position that has generally been taken. You know, to criticize Trump is almost like a divine right of kings, right? It's a religious as well as a political offense. Now, we know that some of the people who do criticize Trump are certainly awful people. Some of the people that do criticize Trump are terrible. But criticizing Trump for when he oversteps his power is something that we should all do as real Jeffersonians. It's something that we should do to be consistent and not allow ourselves to be tied into this political climate where it's us against them all the time. It's the good guys in there, so we're going to let the good guy do whatever he wants, and the bad guy, when he is in, we have to say, no, this is how the left and right operates now. If their guy's in there, well, then everything's good, no matter how much power they abuse. Otherwise, we have to talk about abuse of power. And it's just so blatantly obvious this is what goes on that I think Americans have become disgusted with it. The real Jeffersonian position is to say, you know what, we don't need an elected king. We don't need a president with this much power. Jefferson himself wanted to downgrade the office of the presidency. And he did so as president, particularly in that first term. But the presidents who should be loved are the ones that did not abuse power. And those are the ones that are often slapped to the bottom of any presidential rankings. I talked about this actually in my own podcast this past week, how that's clearly the point of these presidential rankings is to put the people that abuse the power the most, with the exception of one or two, at the top of the list. And that's simply because of reputation, that those people are going to be up there. You know, Washington's going to be there. Even though you can make a case that George Washington certainly made some incorrect decisions as president. His listening to Hamilton during the Whiskey Rebellion is one. His issuing of the Neutrality Proclamation is another. Even though the Neutrality Proclamation was the right idea, it was wrong for a president to issue a proclamation. Presidents don't have proclamation power. It's what a king has. But regardless, I think that this Jeffersonian strain, this Jeffersonian critique of America, whether it's economics, whether it's politics, adhering to real federalism, these are things that we want to do at the Institute. And those are the things that are most represented by Confederate symbols and monuments. There is a clear connection to them. And in fact, the people that erected those monuments often talked about it, or even inscribed it onto the stone of the base of the monument. We know that, and I said at the beginning of this podcast, I've been saying some of the same things for 3 years, the unrelenting assault on Confederate monuments is getting worse. We just saw this week that that the city council in Dallas has decided to bulldoze the Dallas War Memorial, which has been there for near 100 years. But nope, it's now offensive, and so it has to go. We've seen in, I think it was Louisiana just recently, a city council there has decided they're going to take down a statue, and that almost we're going to be powerless to stop it. On a courthouse grounds. So this is where we are. These statues, which are inanimate objects that shouldn't have any kind of, evoke any kind of hatred or feeling, simply as a representation of Confederate soldiers. But they do have that defiant element, and I think that's why everyone wants to take them down or attack them. We did get a positive story of one of those. And it's the story published on Thursday. And the title of that piece is Rescuing Old Joe. It's about what happened in North Carolina. I'm sorry, not North Carolina. Florida. What happened in Gainesville, Florida. Excuse me, I have North Carolina on the brain because we have a piece about North Carolina next week. In Gainesville, Florida, where Old Joe statue was going to be taken down. And the Gainesville City Council, in May of 2017, voted to remove that monument. It had been there for 113 years at that point. And at that point, the president of the local UDC chapter stood up and said, asked, what will they do with that memorial? And the county attorney said, we're just going to scrap it. We're going to sell it at auction if it's worth over $2,000. Otherwise, it's going to be scrapped. And so this president of the UDC stood up and said, well, you can't do that. And she held up the original 1903 document pertinent to Old Joe's legal status. It shows that it remains the property of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And so then the commissioners get together and they huddle. And, okay, well, because of that, we'll give you 60 days to get rid of it. But you have to pay for removing it, everything, security, everything to get rid of this thing. So you know what? The UDC in Gainesville, Florida, launched a campaign to save Old Joe. And they did it through private, small contributions. They didn't ask for large sums of money. They didn't look for any of that. What they wanted was simply enough money to move it, and they did. They moved the monument to a cemetery, and now it's got a big fence around it. You can't hurt it. That's because we know that these knucklebrains on the left, they want to damage these things even in private cemeteries now, destroy them. So this is one for the good guys. This is one for the good guys. In fact, the UDC had raised $30,000 and secured a site on private property near a cemetery to move it. This is a piece by Phil Lee, and it's something. I mean, we have legislation coming out now to try to save these monuments. We see that stuff as just a scrap of paper oftentimes. The courts will try to get around it. We see that in Birmingham right now. We saw that a state judge said that, oh, well, it doesn't matter. The state, I mean, this is violating the free speech of the city of Birmingham. All this nonsense that judges come up with. And that needs to be taken into account when this new legislation is written to protect these monuments. They're only as good as people that are willing to enforce it, and courts that are willing to uphold those documents. But here we had private individuals taking private action to save Old Joe. And I think that's one positive thing. But we know that these monuments, these symbols, they represent something greater than simply that war. They represent a Jeffersonian strain of Americanism that is fast disappearing if it wasn't for things like the UDC, the SCV, the Abbeville Institute, other organizations that are determined to keep those principles alive, that Jeffersonian view of America, the Southern view of America. And I think that's where we do our best work when we try to remind people that the South is 400 years. The South is not 4 years. The South is 400 years. Jefferson is the symbol of that. In so many ways, so is George Washington, but also, James Madison and James Monroe and all the other people, John C. Calhoun. The Southerners that we talk about are the symbol of that. And people knew it, which is why they didn't have any problem to Southern symbols for generations. Those symbols were flown on battlefields. Those symbols were flown on battlefields well into the 20th century. Even in current American conflicts, those symbols have been flown. And nobody has a problem with it because they represent something that's truly American, which is self-determination, self-government, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But that's not, of course, what Lincoln said at the Gettysburg Address, but that's what it really is. And I think as long as we can keep hanging on to these symbols and these monuments, and maybe they're all gone. Maybe it'll end up a situation like they had in Ireland where flying the green flag was illegal, but people still flew it anyways. And eventually, it came around. And eventually, it was seen as a symbol of Ireland. Maybe these Confederate symbols, again, will be seen as a symbol of the South. 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years from now, while the PC attack, the Orwellian assault on these things commences, and it's almost like it's a tidal wave that can't be stopped. Every now and then you have a feel-good story. Every now and then something happens. And we know that there's organizations trying to put battle flags up on highways and all these other kind of things. But we have to change minds. These symbols have to mean something else. And they have to represent that Jeffersonian tradition that they really do represent, but we have to convince people that that's what they are. And that's why the Abbeville Institute exists, to explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition, and that is that Jeffersonianism, the economic critique, the political critique, and those things are important for America moving forward, maintaining that Southern tradition that had that as part of it. It matters. It matters. And if we don't do that, we're lost. We're lost as a people in America. Until next time, good day.